Letters from a Federal Farmer No.2 by Richard Henry Lee was published on October 9, 1787, and reflected the Anti-Federalist perspective on controversial issues regarding the Constitution and the government that it created. Although the Anti-Federalists were a heterogeneous group that consisted of both the elite and working classes, they forged a comprehensive objection to the Constitution. The entirety of the Union was criticized due to the inevitable consolidation of federal power and benefits of a strong national government solely for the central states. Lee credited this to the existence of factions as a result of geographic and cultural barriers that raised challenges to an effective judicial system. He referenced the first letter from a federal farmer in that the country was too populous and too large for a centralized government, with the population of tens of millions and a distance of 800 miles from the central capital to the country's extremes. In the second essay, the geographic challenge of distance was a cause for concern due to the obstacles it posed for fair judiciary proceedings. Lee wrote, "Under one general government alone, there could be but one judiciary. It would be totally impractical in this case to preserve a due administration of justice and the real benefits of the jury trial of the vicinage. The centralized judicial branch would greatly reduce the ability of citizens to gain access to a court of justice in order to receive a trial." This was a prevalent criticism of Anti-Federalists who feared that state courts would become insignificant in comparison to the Supreme Court and that too much power was consolidated in the lifelong Supreme Court judges. His concerns were addressed 2 years later by a compromise between Federalists and Anti-Federalists, also known as the Judiciary Act of 1789, which permitted the Senate to establish various inferior courts that were more easily accessible to the public. Another Anti-Federalist argument was the perceived threat to the right to a trial by jury, which was not guaranteed by the first draft of the Constitution. Ratified in 1791, the Sixth Amendment of the Bill of Rights guaranteed the explicit right of trial by jury, as well as the assurance that the criminal jury would consist of people from the state in which the crime was committed. Although these later compromises were made, the Anti-Federalist writing of the time reflected the belief that both state courts and individual rights would be undermined by the Supreme Court. Further, Lee's writings embodied one of the most significant criticisms of the Constitution, the uneven dispersion of power. He wrote, "But as to powers, the general government will possess all essential ones, at least on paper, and those of the states a mere shadow of power." This represented the Anti-Federalist perspective on the balance of powers between the federal and state governments in order to ensure national rights. Although power was spread out amongst the executive, judicial, and legislative branches, Lee disliked the split between the state and national government, which compromised the public's right to representation. The state governments had the closest connection to the people and most accurately represented their ideals, but they lacked real power over the federal government. An all-powerful central government was criticized to be similar to the age of absolutism in the 1600s that spread throughout European nations, particularly in England. During the reign of Charles I from 1625 to 1649, he attempted to become an absolute monarch by dissolving Parliament for 12 years. The consolidation of power allowed Charles I to rule England ruthlessly without any true opposition or check on his powers. Once Parliament reconvened, the members used support from the public and the religiously prosecuted Puritans to launch the English Civil Wars. King Charles I was eventually executed and a limited monarchy was established. Lee feared that the new federal government would be too strong and would overpower the state governments. He subtly warned the public that a situation similar to the English Civil Wars could erupt due to the consolidation of powers. From the Anti-Federalist point of view, the Constitution contradicted the ideals of Whig ideology and revolutionary republicanism, which promoted limits on the political powers of the government and guaranteed equal rights to all citizens. In particular, Lee listed the enumerated powers given to the federal government in Article 1 of the Constitution, such as the power to tax and control the militia. If the central government retained these powers and its supremacy over the states provided in Article 6, the state governments would either be destroyed or exist aimlessly. In Patrick Henry's speech at the Virginia Ratifying Convention on June 5, 1788, he cited a specific example of the lack of state power in Article 1, Section 8, which bestowed the authority to organize, arm, and discipline an army to Congress. The state governments merely had the responsibility to appoint officers and train the soldiers, which could easily be overridden by the federal government. If Congress refused to create or arm a militia group, The state's power to train soldiers would thus be ineffective. Henry asserted, so that this pretended little remains of power left to the states may, at the pleasure of Congress, be rendered nugatory. The fear that the state governments would dissolve into a mere shadow of power was supported by several examples of the superiority of the federal government. As evidenced by the letters of Cato No. 4, the ideals of Whig ideology, in which power was greatly dispersed, still influenced the mindsets of Antifederalists who did not trust a centralized government with too much concentrated power. Another primary concern among Anti-Federalists was the violation of natural rights due to the lack of public virtues. Lee wrote, "There are other considerations which tend to prove that the idea of one consolidated whole on free principles is ill-founded. The laws of a free government rest on the confidence of the people and operate gently. If they are executed on free principles about the center, where the benefits of the government induce the people to support it voluntarily, yet they must be executed on the principles of fear and force in the extremes." The belief that laws would not be followed voluntarily by the public, but would need enforcement through violence and fear, underscored the author's feelings regarding the republican virtues of the people. Republicanism not only encouraged private virtues of integrity and frugality, but in particular promoted public virtue, which was an individual's responsibility to sacrifice personal desires for the good of the public. In 1776, Republican idealists hoped to disband the original ties among people, such as the bonds between family, known as the secret bonds of society. Instead, new, stronger bonds would be created between individuals, the public, and the state. Lee's attitudes towards the implementation of true Republican virtues in all people revealed his practicality. According to him, a free nation in which the government and the laws were based primarily on the nature of the people would be willingly obeyed solely by those who benefited directly or those who prospered in the central states. This perspective was shared by several others, including French writer Alexis de Tocqueville. He claimed, "The Americans are not a virtuous people, and nevertheless they are free." The loss of virtue was suggested to have resulted from the excesses of democracy because the rights and freedoms guaranteed to the people produced a higher emphasis on private interests rather than the public good. Similarly, Lee believed that Republican virtues would be disregarded by those who lived in the extremes of the country, and the government would be forced to violate the people's natural rights through military measures in order to subdue them. Lee indirectly cited previous revolts, such as the recent Shays Rebellion in 1786, as an accurate example of his apprehensions. During Shays' Rebellion, Massachusetts farmers who were threatened by debt and taxes violated virtues of law and order and used the brute force of mobocracies to violently halt foreclosure courts. In order to successfully subdue this revolt, the Massachusetts government had no choice but to raise a 1,200-troop army under General William Shepherd and use violence to defeat the rebels. Overall, Lee believed that the combination of a consolidated government and few Republican virtues among the people would result in infractions upon the natural rights of men. Ultimately, in the last sentence of the letter, Lee warned, "Neglected laws must first lead to anarchy and confusion, and a military execution of laws is only a shorter way to the same point, despotic government." Lee proved this with experience in reference to the salutary neglect that began under Robert Walpole in the 1700s, which led to the American Revolution. Due to salutary neglect, British mercantilist policies and laws were loosely enforced, which allowed geography, religion, immigration, and wealth to influence the colonists to create a new identity as Americans. Most notably, the Navigation Acts of 1651 prohibited free colonial trade, but lenient enforcement permitted merchants and planters to continue illegal trade with other nations such as the French and the Dutch. Later conflict was caused by attempts to end salutary neglect, such as the Writs of Assistance of 1760. This act gave British soldiers the authority to search and seize any illegal goods, which angered colonists and did not inspire obedience but rather created unrest and protest. Thus, Lee's cautionary tone was directly supported by previous events in American history and provided compelling evidence to the American public that the Constitution would create a government similar to the British monarchy that America had just escaped from. Lee also cautioned that the use of a standing army to enforce laws would also result in anarchy. This referred to the arrival of British soldiers in Boston in 1768 to enforce the end to salutary neglect and stop rebellions against the Stamp and Townshend Acts. Not only did the British regiments create conflict and steal jobs, the presence of the standing army incited hostility between colonists and soldiers, which led to the Boston Massacre of 1770. In the end, although the cautionary criticisms raised by the Anti-Federalists did not prevent the ratification of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights was passed on December 15, 1791, as a compromise between Federalists and Anti-Federalists to explicitly protect the rights of the people and limit the power of the central government.